So thank you all for your time today. As Evan mentioned, I'm Erin, and I'm the Director of Gas Transition Solutions at GTI. I'm a chemist by training, although I've previously worked in a variety of environmental roles at large oil and gas companies. I'll start with casting a little bit of vision as to why GTI views the ability to differentiate across gas operations as important, and then launch into a discussion about our specific differentiated gas initiative. GTI envisions a carbon managed future in which integrated energy systems leverage low carbon gases, fuels, and infrastructure to limit global temperature rise while continuing to expand access to low cost energy sources on a global basis. By deploying clean gases, carbon neutral fuels, and chemicals in ways that build on existing infrastructure, we can reduce costs, lower risk, and provide pathways to economy-wide deep decarbonization that supports growing economies worldwide. Said differently, there will be different kinds of molecules powering our energy systems into the future, but they'll all have one unifying characteristic, and that is that they'll be low carbon and eventually carbon negative for us to be able to deeply decarbonize economies around the world. This will require clear quantification of emissions from different fuels and energy sources. And we'll need to be able to better quantify those emissions and differentiate between those energy sources in order to be truly successful in becoming low carbon and understanding which energy sources are not. Low carbon isn't a concept that ought to simply apply to energy sources of the future. It's a mission critical attribute of energy sources today. Natural gas is expected to continue to play a significant role in the energy landscape well into the mid-century. And so with a focus on what we can do today to achieve decarbonization, given today's energy mix, with an eye toward the future, understanding methane emissions from natural gas becomes really important. The start of 2021 reignited international discussion around commitments to address climate change, and it's clear that the world is proceeding with emission reduction goals and developing policies to enable those reductions. For natural gas to remain a key energy source in a carbon managed world, we're going to have to enable greater emissions reductions, especially because energy forecasters include, such as the EIA, include projections of natural gas that continue to increase and demonstrate a robust demand for gases and liquids into mid-century. Clean natural gas will continue to have an important role to play. Methane leakage across the natural gas system, however, erodes the climate benefits of leveraging natural gas as an affordable energy supply in a global decarbonization strategy. Columbia University's Jonathan Elkind set it out really starkly when he said, "Companies that fail to act now and reduce emissions will suffer the consequences at the hand of investors, government decision makers, and the general public. There will be nowhere to hide methane emissions." As you can see here, methane leakages call into question among the public the credibility of companies and their future in a global clean energy transition. The public is watching and pressure is mounting. Our aim at GTI is to enable reductions of methane emissions to the atmosphere. And to most effectively do that, we have to know where those emissions come from. Methane emissions inventories have long been compiled. As a general matter, whether for regulatory or other purposes, such as incentivized or market incentivized differentiated gas, these emission inventories are built up on an activity and equipment count basis, or an emission factor basis. The inventory then ends up just being a proxy for the physical equipment that's in the field, as opposed to the actual environmental stewardship of individual companies operating that equipment. Yet academia, environmental NGOs, and others have long documented a frequent discrepancy between those so-called bottom-up inventories, or where it's a really accounting-based approach. This is my number of flanges, this is my number of pumps, this is my number of flares, this is my number of tanks, and our top-down or site-level emissions observations. There are varying historical discussions as to why this is so. On the one hand, emission factors have a purpose and a role. They were developed to build up large-scale national-level inventories. And frankly, US greenhouse gas reporting program inventories are some of the, if not the most sophisticated methodologies to do that in the world. The emission factors, however, are not intended to represent individual pieces of equipment, and operators are following the methodologies thrust upon them. There are assuredly examples in those emission inventory methodologies where in certain types of emissions are overestimated. For example, in research I've participated in the past, it would seem that emission factors for pneumatic controllers overestimate that category by at least 30%. And so there are some overs and there are some unders, and they often net each other out. However, this may not be the best data to make all decisions from. On the other hand, as presented by Adam Brandt and other colleagues here at Stanford, natural gas leakage data are statistically heavy-tailed and are more extremely distributed than even other natural and social phenomena. In some cases, they found that 5% of leaks can be responsible for greater than 50% of total leakage volume. This means that there could be whole regions that are underestimated because the super emitters, those disproportionately large leaks at the high end, contribute emissions well above the average. If we are completely fixated on incentivizing emission reductions on an emission factor basis, we do so at the expense of tackling some of the biggest sources. So I ask you, do you want to reduce inventoried emissions, or do you want to reduce actual emissions? Those may not be the same sources. I think we could all agree that actual emissions are the target, and we must incentivize actual emissions reductions if we want to achieve them. We're not incentivizing those actual emissions reduction when all of our assessments are based upon emission factor inventory approaches. We must transition to a discussion around actuals, and that's going to require a paradigm shift. So what are we to do? Some have advocated for the total abandonment of emission factor-based methodologies in favor of site-level emissions. A robust technology ecosystem does not exist today to deliver that at scale. Measurement strategies that would be capable of fulsomely replacing emission factor-based inventories would require multiple spatial and temporal scales of measurements. The moment has arrived, however, where the technology ecosystem can deliver a transition from a purely emission factor-based inventory to one that is measurement informed. Based on research I've conducted in the last few years, there's sufficient progress in measurement technologies to overcome the most significant shortcomings of the emission factor inventory model. That will enable a measurement verified emission factor inventory hybrid approach. So conceptually, you could take the good of the emission factor approach and validate that with measurements. Or when I talk about the most significant shortcoming in emission factor methodologies, that is the ability to account for totally missing sources or disproportionately high sources. So we're starting with a hypothesis that in the absence of super emitters and other unaccounted for larger sources, the existing emission factor methodologies are in fact reasonable. So if we find and quantify the super emitters, we could reasonably differentiate between assets and better measure actual emissions. To that end, the outcome of our differentiated gas initiative will enable just that transition. We'll describe the how, teaming with customers and stakeholders across the entire natural gas value chain. With academia and measurement experts, we'll develop the instruction manual describing the metrics to intercompare like facilities within a particular segment. We'll establish the protocols to describe the measurements that are necessary to locate and quantify super emitters and other unaccounted for sources. And to the extent that those measurements and your emission factor-based inventory are significantly different, we'll develop the protocols to reconcile the two together so that operators can deliver one credible measurement-informed emission intensity for their assets. We'll apply this on a value chain-wide basis. One application of such a methodology is measurement-informed emission intensities for the purpose of differentiated gas. And so to the extent that folks are building market-based incentives to demonstrate lower emission intensity or more responsibly sourced gas, we have a view that such determination should be made on an actual basis. Transitioning from a purely emission factor-based approach to one that is measurement-informed will enhance confidence for stakeholders and result in more effective policy outcomes. We should focus our policies on most cost-effectively eliminating emissions, but that has to be guided by where our actual emissions are coming from. It'll also result in smarter capital deployment strategies for stakeholders that are interested in reducing methane and being sure that where they spend the dollars is having the biggest impact. And it'll increase the public confidence I talked about at the beginning, that actions are being verifiably, measurement verifiably taken. To build an authentic, compelling, credible vision for natural gas as a low cost, low carbon energy source well into the future, low methane emission differentiation must be performed on a measurement basis across the entire natural gas value chain. We've discovered that others agree. In assessing whether or not there was work for us to do, we spoke with industry customers and stakeholders across the value chain to assess what was missing, if anything, from the tools that are necessary to completely move forward in this space. There are a variety of market-based solutions, and I'll mention a few in a moment, that are trying to solve this issue, but there does lack a foundational, complete methodology that's transparent, verifiable, and captures emissions through the entire value chain. We can't debate solutions until we have a technical objective method for measuring emissions. Many of the customers and industry partners were concerned about the lack of insight into how available assessments are even conducted. There's also a credibility problem without objective measurements in this place. Many stakeholders and the public are well aware of the top-down, bottom-up mismatch. And so there's this conversation that's difficult to untangle about what the right emissions number is anyway. And perhaps most importantly, companies informed us that there are major gaps when using emission factors compared to when they evaluate their own emission sources. Not to mention, few options address the entire natural gas value chain. Many of the conversations focus on the production sector, and any conversation that extends to a greater value chain basis often sounds like this: oh, everyone knows all the emissions are in the production segment, but I don't think that's the case. I think that's just the most studied segment. And so we really need to get a view of actual emissions on a value chain wide basis that are measurement informed, and we see that others agree. As I mentioned, there are half a dozen disparate differentiated gas efforts underway that attempt to incentivize methane emissions reductions through the market. Few of these address the entire value chain. Many initiatives only focus on production, although some of them do have an eye toward other segments in the value chain. Right now, 2 gas producers could use different emission schemes, and it'd be unclear who actually has the lower emissions. Without consistent protocols measuring emissions, we'll continue to create confusion in the marketplace and with stakeholders, and we'll fail to build the goodwill and trust that is necessary to propel us into the future. External parties such as investors, regulators, and environmental NGOs don't have a clear differentiated gas value chain wide concept to act with and engage with or endorse. This creates confusion and undermines the potential role that differentiated gas could play as a solution. So the necessary solution is a uniform, measurement-informed, value chain wide concept, and that is what GTI is working on in its differentiated gas initiative. GTI will help companies create a harmonizing framework, develop transparent measurement protocols, and validate that framework through pilot projects. Building this with our customers and stakeholders, again, across the entire natural gas value chain. Really specifically, we'll produce a manual that defines how to calculate actual emissions across the entire value chain, with an eye toward global credibility and confluence with analogous activities, such as those under OGMP 2.0. To do this, we'll develop 4 specific protocols. First will be an emission intensity protocol, which will define the emission intensity metric per segment that will enable comparison of like assets within an individual segment, production assets to production assets, midstream assets to midstream assets. We'll also define measurement protocols by segment on how to take adequate measurements to robustly inform an emission inventory. Third, we'll develop the reconciliation protocols. To the extent that the measurements don't say the same thing as the emission inventory, an operator is left with a too-much problem. Which number is most right, or are either of them correct? So we'll deliver the methodologies to reconcile those two together and come up with one credible answer that represents the particular assets that were observed. And finally, a value chain summation protocol We know that it's not as simple as to simply add the leakage rates across multiple segments. And so we'll develop a methodology that will enable an operator accepting delivery of gas that has been through multiple segments to understand the leakage rate of that delivered gas. That becomes important to end-use customers in LNG shipments and other applications. So together, these actions will build trust in the marketplace and more clearly define methane emissions for companies. The necessary solution is a uniform, measurement-informed, value chain-wide concept, and that's what we're working on. So specifically, the initiative will establish in an open and transparent measurement these protocols along with a broad group of stakeholders working together. In closing, differentiated gas has the opportunity to serve an important role in providing clean, affordable, reliable, and secure energy in a carbon-managed world. Developing these objective and technical frameworks for defining differentiated gas is just one of the many research challenges we face as the world embarks on transition to low-cost, low-energy gas systems. We need ambition, innovation, scale, and collaboration, all of it. We need the best brains on it, so join us.